Hello, and welcome to Teacher-Created Materials Vocabulary Acquisition using Greek and Latin Roots Virtual Workshop. I'm Alan Becker, an Academic Officer for Teacher-Created Materials, and I'm thrilled to be able to share this framework for teaching vocabulary to your students to enhance their comprehension and build their personal lexicon. Teacher-Created Materials is a family-owned company that began in the garage of a teacher over 40 years ago. Our founder, Rochelle Cracchiolo, envisioned creating a company focused on one vision, and that is to create a world in which children love to learn. All of our materials and resources are created by teachers, for teachers and students with this vision in mind. The goals that I have set for this session are to consider the research and the science behind what I'm going to show you today, to discover 4 practical vocabulary strategies that you can use right away with your students. I want you to learn how to quickly introduce word parts and support your English language learners within your classroom. And then the last point here, we're going to focus a lot on vocabulary acquisition and how that's different from just teaching vocabulary. So let's review what you're going to need to be prepared for this virtual training. First of all, it's very simple. You can have sticky notes, which are optional, but you're also going to need your learning reflection guide, as we will be using it throughout this session. Speaking of that learning reflection guide, throughout the webinar, you will occasionally be directed to stop and complete a task on the learning reflection guide. Anytime you see this image, you will know that you need to complete a portion of your learning reflection guide. All right, I hope you're ready to explore this exciting vocabulary framework with me. We're actually going to begin our session with our first stop and do. I want you to think and reflect on 2 questions. The first one is, what do you remember about the way you were taught vocabulary words when you were in school? And our second question is, what resources do you remember that were used in your vocabulary instruction? Pause the recording and complete your responses using the Learning Reflection Guide. When you are finished, please resume the recording. The next item that I would like for you to complete is our second stop and do for our session today. How are your students currently learning vocabulary words in your classroom? Pause the recording and complete your responses using the Learning Reflection Guide. When you're finished, please resume the recording. So what you see here is the model of vocabulary instruction that we're going to be using today. Basically, this flow of instruction is never ending. And what this tells us is that when students have access to more vocabulary, they become more proficient at comprehension, thus giving them an improved capacity to acquire more vocabulary. We're going to take an in-depth look at this model today and learn how to put vocabulary acquisition into action. But first, I like to begin all of my sessions by giving you a glimpse into the why. Number 1, vocabulary deficits are a major cause of problems with reading comprehension. And we know that students with low socioeconomic statuses have a fraction of the vocabulary of those students with higher socioeconomic statuses. And the next thing that I want you to pay attention to is that context is not enough for students to gain vocabulary. What we need is explicit instruction of vocabulary to help our students gain an understanding of new words. And so let's take a look at a little bit of the research behind how students learn new words. The first thing we're going to look at is that learning new words through reading alone is relatively low. Matter of fact, only about 15% of words that are read are actually gained on behalf of the student. And also that words must be repeated in multiple contexts and domains at least 17 times in order for a student to retain them. And so if we look at the science behind what we're going to be exploring today, what we're going to take an in-depth look at is morphology. And so morphology is a critical element of successful vocabulary development and accurate decoding. And an awareness of morphology has been shown to be a strong indicator of and a positive influence upon reading comprehension. And so with this science in mind, something that was very interesting to me when I was doing my research is that there are 12 Latin roots that give students the clues to understanding the meaning of more than 10,000 words. And so I also don't want you thinking that what I'm sharing with you today is in addition to what you already have on your plate as an educator. In fact, our ELA standards are pretty clear when it comes to incorporating this model of instruction into your lessons. And so with what you see here, I want you to understand that everything you're going to see today is all in your standards. Matter of fact, here are some very common standards that we see across the country from state to state. The first one, using common grade-appropriate Greek or Latin affixes and roots as clues to the meaning of a word. The second one, use combined knowledge of all letter-sound correspondences, syllabication patterns, and morphology to read accurately unfamiliar multisyllabic words in context and out of context. And then the last one, demonstrate understanding of figurative language, word relationships, and nuances in word meanings. And so now that you've had a glimpse into the why, the research, and the science of this model of teaching vocabulary, what this tells us is that now we know three very important things. We know that vocabulary instruction needs to be systematic, it needs to be explicit, and we also need to focus on word parts with our students. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you an example of a game that you are actually going to interact with on your learning reflection guide. And so essentially you're going to have 5 to 10 minutes to determine the meaning of the terms or phrases depicted by the following roots and affix combinations that we have created. Now I want you to understand that these are completely made up terms and phrases because you as an adult learner already have a very large lexicon. I'm unsure of what words that you do not know. So I'm actually going to give you some completely made up phrases. And your job is to use your working knowledge of the word parts that I've put together to come up with the meaning of this phrase. So we're going to practice real quick. So the first phrase is bicroner. And you can see down here at the bottom that I've broken that up into its word parts. B-I, C-H-R-O-N, and then E-R. And I want you to take a few seconds to see if you can determine the meaning of this made-up phrase using your knowledge of word parts. And so because this is our example, let me go ahead and give you the meaning, and it means two-timer. And so if we look at our knowledge of word parts, we know that BI means two. We know that CHRON means time or order, and then when we add the suffix ER to CHRON, we get timer, and that gives us the phrase two-timer. Okay, wonderful. So now what I want to do with everybody is you're actually going to get a chance to do this on your own. And so in your learning reflection guide, I have given you 5 more completely made up phrases based off of word parts, and I've actually segmented those for you. And so what I'd like for you to do is in your learning reflection guide, take 5 or 10 minutes to determine the meaning of those terms or phrases depicted by the following roots and affix combinations that I've given you. So go ahead and pause your video, and when you are finished with that, resume your video, and then we will see how many of the answers you got correct. All right, so let's take a look at what the correct responses are, and there can be some modifications with these. I can definitely accept that. But the key here is, have you used your working knowledge of roots and affixes to come up with the meaning of these completely made up words or phrases? And so number 1, we had astro, and then we added a Y to the end of that, and then we had opsy, and then we added an ED. And so the combination of those affixes in the phrase that I determined was starry-eyed. And so we know that astro means a reference to the stars, and when we add a Y to the end, we get starry. And then we have to make this one hyphenated, as opsy means eye, and of course adding ED to the end of that, we get eyed, which gives us the phrase starry-eyed. And then in number 2, we had hemi and then mort. And so if we use our working knowledge of these two bases, we know that hemi means half and that mort means death or dead. And so majority of you probably thought of hemisphere and what our hemisphere actually does on our world or on our globe. And then you thought about where you've seen this word base before, M-O-R-T. Most of us think of a mortician or maybe a morgue, and we know that those individuals in those places deal with dead bodies. And so we get half dead. Number 3 is actually my favorite, and in a lot of my trainings is probably the one that's the most missed. And with number 3, here we have the base platy, or P-L-A-T-Y, and then we have rupt, and then we add an ed to the end of that. And so very simply, when we put all these 3 together, the phrase that I came up with is flat broke. And so if you think about, like we said it earlier, your working knowledge of these word parts. Platy, you may think of where you've seen that before, and the most common place we've seen that is an animal within the platypus. And the platypus is actually named a platypus because P-L-A-T-Y means flat, and a platypus has a flat bill, a rather large flat bill. And then we look here at rupt, and we may think of something that happens to us all the time in our classrooms, which is interrupt, which is a break in the conversation. And so rupt means break or to tear, or in some places an explosion. But for this phrase, it means break, and then of course we add an ed to the end of that, which makes break past tense, and then it becomes broke, and the entire phrase is flat broke. Then let's take a look at number 4. We have vis and then ocule, ocule. We have that twice. And so the phrase meaning is see eye to eye. Vis means to see, and then ocule refers to the eye. And as you can already tell if you've ever had a course in medical terminology, a lot of this becomes very easy to you. All right, so let's take a look at number 5, which is Benny, and then viv or vive. And then once again, think about where you've seen these word parts. I always think of the word beneficial when I see B-E-N-E. And then vive, we have several words that come to mind. Revive, which is to make alive again. And so we come up with the phrase good life. And so you'll see here that with all of these 5 completely made up words or phrases, we can actually construct meaning based off our knowledge of word parts. And like I said earlier, this is really what I wanted to do is put you back into the shoes of learning vocabulary words or coming across vocabulary words for the first time. And so, just like our students do, you did have the option of skipping to the next one. I hope you did not do that. But when you came across it, I really wanted you to break it apart to give you and your students another tool for your toolbox in decoding vocabulary words. And so this is just one of the steps that we're going to use today in helping us and helping our students understand and determine the meaning of unknown words. And the first step is to, can we break it apart into its word parts, and can we define those? So, like I said, just putting you back into the shoes of an elementary or middle school student, or even high school student once again, and coming across words you don't know, and how can we determine the meaning of those? So I hope you enjoyed that. And so one of the things that I've just engaged you in is what we call language play. And so whether or not you have a comprehensive vocabulary solution in your school or your district, the research about student acquisition of words is pretty clear. And one thing that we can do with students is let them engage in language play. And with language play, we know that there's a strong relationship between vocabulary and achievement. And so one of the things that we can do here is make sure that we provide engaging and relevant opportunities for students. Language play is also a high-yield strategy to engage students with. It allows for cooperative learning amongst our students, and it gives them time for practice and then enforcement of what it is that we've taught them. And the other thing that it does for them is it shows them that games equal learning. So, for example, we can take a nuanced understandings of words, multiple meaning words, and then give a continuum of words to engage students within language play. And so there are a few rules that we need to understand when we engage students in language play. And number 1, that is that there is a routine. And this is just to help us maximize instructional time within our classrooms. That we need to teach. And very simply, we have to show, model, scaffold, and explain. Very, very similar to what I did earlier with the model using by Kroner in that activity you just completed. And then we also need to make sure that we follow a gradual release of responsibility with our students. And so there are some hidden rules that we have that aren't really told to us up front. And the first one is that some of the responses that we're going to get from students can have more than one right answer, especially when we look at words that have multiple meanings, and then we think about the varying background knowledge bases that our students have coming to us. And then we also may have students that just have a different understanding of the word altogether. And the next thing is that there is an open door to connecting all areas of language. And that is, once again, in our standard, with our reading standards, our writing standards, and our speaking and listening standards. And ultimately, we want students to be able to read words and then use it in their writing and then in their speaking when they're responding to us, the educator in the room. And so let's take a look at our first strategy that I want to share with you today out of our 4, which is called semantic feature analysis. And so the semantic feature analysis strategy uses a grid to help kids explore how sets of things are related to one another. By completing and analyzing the grid, students are able to see connections, make predictions, and master important concepts that you're hoping to teach them. And this strategy enhances comprehension and vocabulary skills. And so when we look at semantic feature analysis and a few other things that it does for our students, it gives them the chance to identify features that words have in common. It also gives them an opportunity to distinguish between words and emphasizes uniqueness in words. And it also allows for background knowledge that students have to support their understanding of the different vocabulary words that you choose to use in the semantic feature analysis. And so there are a couple ways that you can organize this. In this example, what we see is at the very top of this grid, we have the connected vocabulary words, which are just very simply the words that you would choose from whatever text it is you're reading or from whatever unit it is that you're teaching that you want your students to understand. And then on the left-hand side, this is where you would apply the features for the students to use for comparison. Or we can kind of flip-flop that, and we can put those connected vocabulary words on the left-hand side of the grid and then put the features to use for that comparison or analysis at the top. And so just a few other things that we can use a semantic feature analysis grid for. We can include descriptions, features, multiple vocabulary words, parts of speech, and then even pictures for our students that are English language learners to be able to interact with this grid. For my example that I'm going to use today, we're going to use a leveled nonfiction text about engineering from a Time for Kids series. If you see here, we are actually going to be working with some pretty advanced vocabulary. One thing I would like to point out is the repeated use of the vocabulary word engineering. So the vocabulary words that we will be studying are aligned at the top of this matrix, and the features to analyze the words are on the left-hand side. We're actually going to determine, after the reading, which type of job an engineer does and what the engineer actually does. Think of this example as a way to increase the vocabulary and the comprehension of the students, even before, during, and after reading. And one thing that's really interesting to point out about showing them this semantic feature analysis before the reading takes place is this really serves as a previewing activity for the content that we're going to be reading together. So here's the front cover of our text, Enhancing Engineering, and like I said, it is from our STEM Careers series, which we are closely aligned with Time for Kids content for Enhancing Engineering. And we're actually going to be looking at chemical engineering, a section on civil engineering, another one on electrical engineering, and then mechanical engineering. And so if you will, entertain me for just a few minutes as I do a read aloud of just a couple of these pages from this series so we're able to complete this semantic feature analysis correctly. Chemical engineering. Think about your favorite toys when you were young. With the exception of stuffed animals, the toys were most likely made from plastic. You can thank a chemical engineer for those toys. Chemical engineers create better plastics, paper, paint, medicine, and fuel. Their jobs include, for example, designing plastic toys that are both safe and fun for children. Have you ever been in a freshly painted room and smelled strong chemicals? Chemical engineers work to create non-toxic paint so that people don't get sick from the fumes. They take lumber and bark and turn them into paper products such as notepads and cardboard. These engineers also work to build more fuel-efficient vehicles. Civil engineering. If you like organizing and planning big projects, civil engineering might be great for you. Civil engineers have designed a tunnel that could cross the Bering Strait. The tunnel would span about 60 miles, that's 96.5 kilometers, and connect Russia and Alaska. Other engineers have drafted a plan for Tokyo's Sky City 1000. This high-rise city with apartments, offices, theaters, and schools will house approximately 35,000 people. Imagine a city within a pyramid. Civil engineers have proposed that too. It is called the Megacity Pyramid, and the plans are to build it over Tokyo Bay in Japan. About 1 million people will be able to live there. While these projects are in the designing and testing phases, the Burj Al Arab is a reality. It is a luxury hotel in Dubai. It stands 1,050 feet, or 320 meters tall, and the hotel's restaurant is suspended 82 feet, or 25 meters, away from the main building. Civil engineers figure out how to build these amazing structures and make them safe. They have to understand how weather affects the materials they use. If it rains, will the saturation of water affect the building? If the ground swells, will the structure be compromised? They also must know the chemical properties of the metals they use. Ferrous metals, like steel, are strong but heavy, and non-ferrous metals are also strong but much lighter. Electrical engineering. Have you ever ridden a roller coaster and felt a funny feeling in your stomach? Electrical engineers have a lot to do with making a ride thrilling but also safe for riders. It takes electricity to help create the thrills and chills. Electricity is used everywhere. We use it to communicate with others. Movie theaters use it to show the latest films. Hospitals use it to power the machines that keep people alive and well. Electrical engineers must understand all about electricity and how it works. To do this, they should have a good understanding of atoms. Atoms contain electrons that, when moved from one atom to another, create electricity. Engineers choose materials based on how much current is needed. Materials that conduct electricity allow it to flow freely. Electrical engineers understand how to harness the power of an electrical charge. They make the electricity flow safely so that it can power up gadgets of all kinds. Electrical engineers design computer circuits. They also develop and test electrical equipment in navigation and communication systems. They devise power grids and work on power supplies. And right now, they are designing the next big thing in electronics. Who knows what it'll be? Mechanical engineering. Some people think mechanical engineers are mechanics who repair machines or motors. But actually, they are the people who design, create, and improve the machines that mechanics work on. In general, mechanical engineering has to do with things that move. Mechanical engineers designed the flight hardware of NASA's Orion spacecraft. NASA is hopeful it will take astronauts to Mars someday. Think of your favorite music. A type of mechanical engineer mixed the sounds to get the music you enjoy. What car features might not have existed when your parents were young? Mechanical engineers designed these improvements. Mechanical engineers have to understand the physical properties of materials. How much stress and strain can a material handle? Is the material hard enough? Will it function well? These are just some of the questions that mechanical engineers think about when designing. So thank you for entertaining me during this read aloud for you today. Now is the time for your fourth stop and do of this workshop. Please take a moment to pause the recording and complete the activity on your learning reflection guide. And feel free to go back and listen to the read aloud if needed to complete the semantic feature analysis on your own. Just as you used the semantic feature analysis for just basic comprehension of content and specific vocabulary words that you've chosen, we can also use that for word parts. And in this case, we're going to use prefixes with a semantic feature analysis. And so if you'll see here, these are just some very easy to do homemade anchor charts based on directional prefixes. And so if you'll look at these four, we're going to be focusing on DI, DIF, and then DIS, which all have the meaning not or apart. Specifically, we're going to focus on 10 of these words throughout the next couple of strategies. Disagree, direct, discuss, differ, distract, digress, dissect, diverse, discourage, and then difficult. And so what I'd like you to do is now your next stop and do within your learning reflection guide. And so just as we did with the content from that leveled reader, I want you to indicate using a plus sign or a minus sign which of these words has a suffix, which of them is a verb, which of them has the meaning or the prefix meaning not, and which of them has the prefix meaning apart, using your knowledge of the word parts with these 5 vocabulary words. Go ahead and pause the recording and then resume when you're finished, and we'll move on to the next portion. Okay, great. So now that you've completed that, what I want you to be thinking of as sort of a personal reflection is what else can you use a semantic feature analysis for? So I've given you 5 other examples right here. Shapes, animals, plants, body systems, and even characters. I know in a lot of my live trainings, I get a lot of responses as far as different ELA standards that can be used with a semantic feature analysis. And characters and character analysis is always one of them, which is why I put them here for you. So I want you to think of, and you can pause the recording if you'd like, what other ways could you use semantic feature analysis across other content areas? All right, now that we've taken a look at semantic feature analysis, let's dive into the second strategy for today, which is called the odd word out. And what odd word out allows us to do as educators, and then allows our students to do, is it allows for them to compare like words. But the other thing that we have to make sure they do is to identify a rule that creates the similarities between those rules, and then also recognize words that do not follow a rule. And this helps them build oral and written language. It also helps promote classification, analysis, and creative thinking about words, and allows for divergent thinking. So think back to all your years of teaching, and you know you've had at least 1 or 2 students that when you ask a question, sometimes they give you an answer or a response that's just way out of left field. Well, what we do is we consider those are divergent thinkers. And in a strategy like odd word out, this is where those particular types of students really shine. And so as a model example for you, we're going to take a look at 3 words: sun, North Star, and asteroid. What I would do is I would make sure that I set a few guidelines for you. So you can take the opportunity to write these 3 words down: sun, North Star, and asteroid. And so I would ask you, if you were a student in my classroom, what do these words have in common? Which is the word that doesn't belong? And what is different about the word? And then tell me why. So obviously with question number 1, I'm asking you to establish a set of rules for why those words have something in common. And then for number 2, which is the word that doesn't belong, establishing a rule for why the certain words don't belong. And then, of course, by answering my next 2 questions, what is different about the word, and then why, kind of tapping into the divergent thinking process that you may have or that your students may have. And so if you haven't already, go ahead and take a moment to write those down: sun, North Star, and asteroid. And then just mentally decide which of those words is the odd word out. And so once you've completed that, we can move on to actually doing this with word parts as well. And so this is what I'd like you to do for your next stop and do activity. And so in your learning reflection guide, you have these words: disinterest, dictionary, dispose, and then divert. And so I'd like for you to follow the directions in your learning reflection guide and tell me which of these following words is the odd word out and why. And go ahead and pause the recording and take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete that. And when you're finished, resume the recording and we'll move on to our third strategy. All right, so let's move on to our third strategy. And I can honestly say that I love all the strategies that I'm showing you today, but I do have a very soft spot in my heart for divide and conquer, just because of the impact that it had on my students year to year. Some figures that are pretty outstanding when we consider their impact on vocabulary instruction. And so once again, we're going to be referencing morphology. And if you look at the top of this slide, morphology is the study and description of how words are formed in language. It relates to the segmentation of words into affixes, which are just prefixes and suffixes, and roots or base words. And so if you look at these two bullet points at the bottom, there are 20 prefixes that account for 97% of prefix occurrences in printed English. And then there are 20 suffixes that account for 93% of suffix occurrences in printed English. So even if you want to begin your year or even in the middle of the year and you don't feel like teaching root words or base words, you're still going to have a pretty powerful impact on vocabulary acquisition by just teaching these 20 prefixes and these 20 suffixes based on their occurrences in printed English. And so I always like to point out the impact across different content areas. And so what you see here is an example of a template that PLCs have used in schools and in districts that I've worked with. And very simply, we know that we are going to expose students to these word parts in our English language arts block, but we also want to expose students to these word parts in science, social studies, and mathematics. Now, we can also extend that into other content areas like art and like music and physical education. But if you look here, we have 3 examples. We have DE, which means down or from, tract or TRACT, which means pull or drag, and then EQUI, EQUI, which means equal. And so if we look at how we can use this in science, social studies, and math, in science we can use DE by exposing them to the word decompose, in social studies, depression, and in mathematics, decrease. And then you see the examples that we used in other content areas with TRACT, tract, and then EQUI, which means equal. And so I want you to think about this. If you do want to take this particular planning method with your grade level colleagues, thinking about how you can expose students to these word parts across multiple content areas. And in your learning reflection guide, I've actually given you some very common word parts that are used in many different content areas. So let's dive into divide and conquer. And so what divide and conquer does is it provides opportunities for students to see the root. And then this can be used to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. So essentially, by helping students build strategies that allow them to dissect words by looking for familiar word parts, we're teaching them another aspect of decoding. And if they can take apart a word and define its word parts, they have a better chance of coming up with the meaning of the unknown word. So we can engage students in the divide and conquer strategy in a variety of ways. So let's take one of the words that we've been working with, distract. And we need to break it apart into its word parts. Number 1 is DIS, which means apart, and then tract, which means to draw, okay? And so if we put these word parts together and kind of reverse them, we can come up with the meaning to draw apart. Look up the word distract. A very familiar iteration of that definition will be in our dictionary. So just in case you want to fact check me on this one. Now let's go to a different way to look at this. And this is by using a strategy within divide and conquer called word math. And I'll show you how this works. So if we take a word that's pretty familiar as our model, transportation. All right, and we break transportation up into its parts. We get transport and then the suffix ation. Now to make word math work correctly, what we have to do now is we have to define each of the parts of this word. But once we define it, then we kind of flip it around and we start from the end first. And so let me show you what that means. So if you'll see here, we've broken it up into transport and then ation. And I want to make sure that I'm defining my suffix first, which means the act or process of. And then we're going to define the root port, which means to carry, and then trans, which means across. And when we put that together and we go left to right, we can come up with a definition very similar to this. Transportation is the act of carrying something across an area. So let's look at a word that's a little bit more difficult to dive into. But when we break it apart into its word parts, what we see here is we have a prefix, we have a pretty established root, and then a suffix. Prefix is dis. The root is actually cour, and then the suffix is ment. So let's define each of those parts and then work backwards. So the definition of that suffix is thing or resulting action. The root means heart or feeling, and then our prefix means not. And so if we look at going from left to right and creating a definition, discouragement is not having the heart or enthusiasm, or a definition of something similar like that. And so you actually have this template in your learning reflection guide. And what I'd like for you to do is actually engage with this particular template with your stop and do number 7. So with stop and do number 7, if you'll just follow the directions on your learning reflection guide, pause this video, and when you're finished, resume the video, and we'll move on to our next portion. Okay, wonderful. So now that you've had some time to interact with the divide and conquer strategy yourself, just as we divide and conquer the vocabulary words that our students come across, we can also teach them how to combine and create vocabulary words. And so a couple things to note here with the combine and create strategy is we already know that words can be broken down into meaningful units, and this is an important and powerful first step in vocabulary development. And so an obvious next step would be that students also need to think about this process from the other direction and to combine word parts to make words or to create those words. And so I'd actually like for you to engage in what combine and create actually looks like. And you have this in your learning reflection guide. And very simply, I've given you 5 prefixes that are indicated using the color green. And I've given you 5 suffixes that are indicated using the color red. And then I've given you a root or a base word, which is struct right here in the middle. And so what I'd like for you to do is time yourself. Give yourself 60 seconds using your learning reflection guide and come up with as many real words as possible that you can within that guide within a 1-minute time frame. And make sure to use the honor system and time yourself. So go ahead and pause this video, complete that section of your learning reflection guide, and once you're finished, resume it and we will move on. Okay, perfect. So I'm glad you got a chance to actually engage with combining and creating words, which is a really great preview for the next portion of what I'm getting ready to teach you about combining and creating. And just in case you're wondering, the average number of words that I usually get within a 60-second time span is about 14 or 15 real words that are created. So if you were above that, then kudos to you. And so one of the ways that we can engage students in using the combine and create strategy within the classroom is by giving them a matrix to use, very similar to sort of the matrix that we used using the semantic feature analysis. And so what you'll see here is that there are actually 4 prefixes, con, de, in, and ob, and then we have 3 roots or bases at the top of this matrix. And we can do this a couple different ways with our students. Number 1, we could have students work in pairs to build words with that struct base. And then make sure that we're telling them to be sure to complete every box. And then as an extension, we can ask our students, what other words have you identified or know of that also uses that base struct that you do not see within this matrix? And so one of the things that I want you to do, and just kind of do this mentally, is that if you have engaged your students within this particular strategy using this matrix, think about what else you could do to have them extend their learning. More specifically, extend their knowledge of the vocabulary that they just acquired by using the combine and create strategy. And so like I told you in the very beginning of this virtual workshop, I want to address our English language learners, more specifically how to provide very quick and efficient support for them while you're using word parts in your vocabulary instruction. And specifically today, I want to show you the power that cognates have in supporting your English language learners. And if you're not familiar with what a cognate is, these are words that share a common root. And so another strategy that I'm going to show you today deals with cognate connections. And so when we make cognate connections with our students, we have to understand that cognates can also be words in two languages that share similar meanings, spellings, and pronunciations. And another piece of evidence that is pretty outstanding when we look at it is that more than 20,000 of our English words have direct Spanish cognates. And if you'll also see that these English words make up 30 to 40% of the average English lexicon. And just looking at that number right there is pretty outstanding in understanding the research and the impact that cognate connections have. And so let's start and begin by showing you these cognate connections in action. So at your desk, in your classroom, or even on your couch, what I'd like for you to do is engage in this actual activity where we're going to introduce students to these three Latin bases, MOV, MOT, and then mobil or mobil. So you're very simply just going to follow the directions to figure out the meaning of these bases. So number one, I want you to move your hand on top of your other hand. Number two, remove the top hand. Number three, motion yes with your head. And then number four, pretend to drive an automobile. And so very simply put, I'm going to ask you, what do the bases MOV, MOT, and mobil or mobil mean based off of the motions and the activities that you just engaged in? And so now what I want you to do is on your learning reflection guide, actually work on the stop and do number 9 within that guide. And so it's pretty simple. Each of these words that I'm getting ready to show you uses MOV, MOT, or mobil, which all have the meaning move as a base, as I'm sure you determined based off the activities and motions that you just engaged in. And so I actually want you to use the word move to explain what these mean. So I want you to follow the directions within your learning reflection guide and complete stop and do number 9. Go ahead and pause this recording, and when you're finished, resume, and we'll move on to the next portion. And so very simply put, what we just did was we introduced students to the root and using a very specific set of kinesthetic directions and helping them understand what the meaning of these roots are. And so moving on, I always used to love to give my students some information based off some real-world experiences and where they may have seen these root words before just in their environment. And so we do this by showing them a did you know infographic. So basically the word motel is a short form of motor hotel. As highways were built across America, more people began to travel. Roadside hotels were built. That way, people traveling would have places to spend the night. These motor hotels became known as motels. This is because they were for people on the move. So letting our students know that words have a very specific meaning in which they were created and how they're used. And so we're going to take a look at cognate connections in those same three Latin bases that we used, MOV, MOT, mobil, and see how they're used in the Spanish language. And so if these are the English words that we engaged our students in with the particular vocabulary words from that activity, let's take a look at these direct Spanish cognates that the majority of our students have a good chance of being exposed to. And we see the 7 of them right here. And so just having them use their knowledge of how they may have heard those Spanish terms used, whether it's in writing or speaking or listening, or even reading, and how that relates to the English vocabulary words that we've taught them is pretty powerful. And just an example of those cognate connections that we can make. And so I'm actually going to show you another way that we can do that using these 3 base words, SED, SID, and SESS. And so the goal for this particular activity is for you to try to determine the meaning of these 3 base words, SED, SID, and sess using only context. And so I'm going to do this through a series of questions. And I don't want you to respond to the question. I just want you to think about what the meaning of those bases are as it's being used in the question. And so number one, what is the address of your residence? Number two, in what state are you a resident? Number three, do any brothers or sisters reside with you? Number four, name 3 activities you do in your residence every day. And our last one, what do we call the residence of the President of the United States? And I'll give you just a few moments to internalize and digest those 5 questions and try to come up with the meaning of SED, SID, and SESS using only context. And so what's interesting about this particular activity is that you may give me some sort of response that revolves around, a place where you live or a place that you are or something, that involves some sort of description like that. But it's really interesting that each of these bases means to sit or to settle. And so this is an example of a more complex base word. But as long as students are giving us something that closely relates to sitting or settling, then we've accomplished our goal in getting them to understand the meanings of these 3 bases. And so what I want you to do now, this is actually your 10th stop and do within your learning reflection guide. And so I'd like you to take these 5 phrases, and you're actually just going to choose one. You're either going to choose a class in session, a sedentary job, sedimentary grit, preside over a meeting, or obsessed with tomorrow's test. And very simply what you're going to do is you're going to explain how your particular phrase and that base word within that phrase means to sit or to settle using the context clues within that phrase for help. And if you need any more direction, you can follow those directions on your learning reflection guide. So go ahead and pause this video, and when you're finished, resume the video and we'll move on to our next portion. All right, so let's take a look at how we can make those cognate connections with our students. So these 3 base words, you've heard me say them multiple times, SED, SID, and SESS. And these were 5 of the vocabulary words that we exposed our students to. So let's look at the direct Spanish cognates that English language learners would more than likely have coming into our classroom. And I'll give you just a few seconds to actually look and internalize these direct Spanish cognates. And so what's interesting is just using those few English words in our vocabulary instruction and then showing students the direct Spanish cognates that those English words and Spanish words have in common is pretty powerful, especially when we look at the number that we have here up on the screen, in hopes that our students have been exposed to these in either reading, writing, or listening, or actually using them in their speech. So that gives you an overview of how we can make those cognate connections, and I will encourage you to seek out what those cognate connections are in relation to the Spanish vocabulary words that your students may be exposed to in helps of bridging that gap between the English language and the Spanish language with your English language learners. And so the last thing that we're going to do today is really kind of bringing this all together and looking at what true vocabulary acquisition is and how when we give students the knowledge of word parts and then we give them the knowledge of the types of context clues and how to use them, and we put those 2 together, this is what really develops true vocabulary acquisition. And so what I want you to know, and you have all 8 of these context clues in your learning reflection guide, is that there are actually 8 types of context clues used in literature and informational text. Their definition, restatement or a synonym, a contrast or an antonym, comparison, examples, list or series, cause and effect context clues, and then description or inference context clues. And so I can remember my first year, even my second year in the classroom, when I was teaching context clues, I just told students to read around the word and just find a clue to the meaning. But then in my research, I found out very quickly that there are 8 specific types of context clues. And I'm going to show you an example of a couple right here. So if we look at this, the comparison context clue. Well, the explanation is that the unfamiliar word is shown to be the same as another word. And so you're going to get some keywords with this comparison context clue, which I like because it helps students be able to identify this. And so to give you an example, the example that we're going to use here is, my brother is enthralled by birds, similar to the way that I am fascinated by insects. Well, very simply, if I ask the students, what does the word enthralled mean in this sentence? Then, of course, they're going to look for some clues around the word, but we're actually comparing the word enthralled to fascinated. And enthralled really has the same meaning as fascinated, thus being the example of a comparison context clue. And if we look at probably one of my favorites to do, because we're always building and helping students understand how to make inferences within our classrooms, the description or the inference context clue basically is that the meaning of the unfamiliar word can be inferred from the description of a situation or experience. And so the example that I'm giving you here, the monkey's vociferous chatter made me wish I had earplugs. Well, let me ask the students, what does the word vociferous mean in this sentence? Well, you need a little bit of background knowledge to be able to determine the meaning of vociferous right here. So if students know what earplugs are used for, they know that they're used to block out noise. Therefore, them coming up with the meaning of the word vociferous, which means very loud and annoying. And so I encourage you to teach your students the 8 types of context clues. And then when we use those in conjunction with the knowledge of word parts that we've given our students, then we can teach them and have them engage within the read and reason strategy. Now, the read and reason strategy is interesting because it's something that you're probably more than likely already doing in your classroom. I just want to help you modify it a little bit. But here's what it does. It teaches students to use surrounding context that is grammatical, structural, or oral. And because many of our English words have multiple meanings, it is important for us to teach students to use specific context to help us determine the meaning of that specific word. And then the other thing that the read and reason strategy allows students to do is to understand words by reading and listening, and then also drawing on them when they're using them in their writing or their speaking. And what we want to do with the read and reason strategy is use several words with a focus on one root. So let me show you exactly what that looks like. So here we have 2 paragraphs from a passage, and we've all used passages in our English language arts instruction with our students, so continue to do so, but I want to show you how this works. So we have 2 passages here, and I'm going to pause briefly while you read these to yourself. And so now that our students have read these 2 paragraphs, we want to provide them with some very simple directions. Number 1, obviously like you've just done, read the passage. Number 2, pay attention to the italicized words. And then number 3, answer the questions. And so let me show you an example of what these questions are. So number 1 asks, what do you think is the most interesting information in this passage, and explain why. And basically what we're doing here is we're just asking them a basic comprehension question to see if they've actually read the passage. Number 2, we're going to ask them, what does the phrase structurally secure mean as it is used in the paragraph? Number 3, what italicized word in the above text refers to a traffic jam? And then number 4, the word infrastructure is made up of 2 Latin roots. What are they and what do they mean? So what you see here is an example of using the read and reason strategy and very specifically giving a focus on multiple words using the same root. So they're able to use them, they're able to tell you what they mean, and then hopefully they're internalizing them a little bit quicker so they can use them in their writing and in their speaking. So let's review our goals for this session today. And the first one was I wanted you to consider the research and the science behind everything that I've shown you today. The second one was I really wanted to show you, and I hope that you're able to quickly and efficiently use 4 practical vocabulary strategies in your classroom. Number 3 is to learn how to quickly introduce word parts and to support your English language learners, and we did that through the Cognate Connections strategy that I showed you. And then this last point is to kind of bring everything together and how knowledge of word parts and a knowledge of context clues really supports vocabulary acquisition. And so I leave you with this infographic. Basically, knowledge of morphology and then knowledge of context clues is really where our students learn vocabulary acquisition as a skill. And so giving them the tools to acquire their own vocabulary rather than teaching them a set of 8 to 10 vocabulary words per week. And so I also want to tell you that Teacher Created Materials is providing you with many different professional learning experiences, whether it's through our on-demand webinars, our coffee chats that we're delivering on trending subjects, and even our presentations by distinguished authors and experts that are in the field today and that are also encountering the same challenges that you're encountering at the school level. And just know that we're working hard to support you wherever you are teaching today and in the future, whether that's in the classroom, at home, or via remote learning. And so I'd just like to say thank you for interacting in this session today, and I hope that you're able to take many of these strategies and apply them in your classroom as soon as tomorrow. Thank you and take care.